Hello, and thank you so much for joining this session on applying behavioral science to the prevention of violent extremism. We'd love to know where you're connecting from and which organization you work for, so please do let us know in the chat box. My name is Roxani Roshas, and I work for UNDP's regional hub for the Arab states. We're based in Amman, Jordan, and I'm based specifically in the regional innovation team. And just in case this is the first session you're joining, UNDP Arab States is organizing this event as part of UN Behavioural Science Week. The session's being recorded, as are all other BeSci Week events, and these have started going up on a dedicated playlist on the UN Innovation Network's YouTube channel. So I'll share the link in the chat. On screen, you see some more resources on applying behavioral science in the UN system, including the Secretary General's guidance notes on behavioral science that was published this week alongside an accompanying report featuring experiences from 25 UN entities. I also encourage you to join the UN Behavioral Science group, which is open to external observers as well. And you'll find more information about that on the website of the UN Innovation Network and on Twitter. Now at UNDP, we see behavioral science as a way of enhancing the design and effectiveness of our programming, a way of testing our numerous assumptions about what works in sustainable development programming, and doing things in a way that is more human-centered and evidence-based. BeSci is being applied in a whole range of policy areas across UNDP, and we have this working dashboard of initiatives if you want to know more. Now, one of the most complex challenges to which we've applied behavioral science is the prevention of violent extremism. We found that leveraging a more nuanced understanding of what motivates behavior can strengthen our efforts to reduce engagement and re-engagement in violent extremism, and that even small adjustments to the way that we deliver projects can have quite a significant impact on our initiatives. This work on BI for PBE, which we've had the pleasure of partnering with Nudge Lebanon on, started back in 2018, though its conceptualization goes back even further. It started in Sudan and Yemen, where the UNDP country offices experimented with building resilience to radicalization among prison populations and increasing attendance in psychosocial support programs. And most recently, experimentation has expanded to Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan with the remarkable support of the UNDP's Crisis Bureau and PBE team. With Nudge Lebanon, we recently launched a step-by-step guidance note, which is aimed at development practitioners and goes through the full process of applying behavioral sciences in the formulation and implementation of PBE programs. So everything really from identifying the specific aspect of PBE on which to intervene, identifying the target population and the best entry point, exploring the behavioral barriers and biases, and ultimately selecting the right behavioral tools and designing a measurement approach and an experiment. And today what we want to do is walk you through those steps in some detail. So for that, we're really fortunate to be joined by Dr. Fadi, who's the head of B4 Development and founder of Nudge Lebanon, and who's really been a pioneer in bringing the behavioral sciences into the Arab region. And also very happy to introduce his colleague, Nabil Saleh, who is the Vice President of Strategy at Nudge Lebanon. Throughout their presentation, please drop your questions in the chat. We'll have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. And for that, we'll also be bringing in colleagues from the global PBE team and from some of the country offices that have applied interventions in these areas. And you'll hear examples from their experiences in Nudge Lebanon's presentation as well. So thank you very much, and over to the colleagues from Nudge Lebanon.
Thank you very much, Roxani, for the introduction. Thank you for inviting us to be part of this. It's great to be with great colleagues, with great friends, old faces we've been working with for the last few years, testing and trialing, proving the concept, which is now beyond kind of trying to prove it's there, it's a reality. So today's presentation, Nabila and I are going to cover the following things. So first, we're going to provide a background on the rise and growth of behavioral insights around the world, with a focus on our part of the world, all the way to this concept being applied to violent extremism. The second thing that we want to focus on today is introduce this guidance note that we work on with very proudly with UNDP, which is essentially about how to apply behavioral insights to violent extremism. And the third thing that we want to do today is give examples of this step-by-step approach provided in the guidance note. So we'll try to make it as interactive as possible. And finally, we'll end with sharing lessons learned about kind of what we kind of did learn from this exercise and what is the way forward for behavioral insights. Right, so if we all go back to what we've been learning at university in standard economic theory, we've been taught that people are rational agents, and basically our decision, everybody's decision, is based on more or less optimal calculation of cost and benefit, which leads essentially to us acting in our own interests. Unfortunately, that is not always true. Actually, I would go even further. This is systematically and predictably not true. And that basically has been shown through a long list of experiments showing that we often do not act in a rational way. And then basically what the whole behavioral economics movement, it has come to correct that theoretical framework in standard economic theory. And basically it posits that new assumptions are important to take into consideration if we are to design policies that are applicable and that are realistic about human nature. So basically all it does, this whole behavioral science movement and what you hear, behavioral insights, behavioral economics, it tries to take into consideration all these assumptions about people, and then take into consideration the biases that are in our human mind, hopefully with a view to better understand why we act in a particular way. And in particular, what we've seen in the various kind of tools used by decision makers is essentially sharing. Nabil, are you sharing basically, Nabil, can you go to the next slide, please? Right, so what we've been seeing by policymakers is that essentially they use the conventional weapons, and the conventional weapons are essentially either what we call command and control. If you don't do this, you'll be penalized. You have sanctions, you have bans, you have a lot of these command and control. On the extreme other side, we have the rewards and incentive. Every time you do something good, we're going to reward you. And we've seen that both are not realistic. Even in the richest of all countries, pouring money at the problem would not work. And in the middle, we have a lot of basic provision of information, all based on the assumption that we are natural processes of information, which allows us to act in our best interest. In contradistinction to this, or I would like to say in a complementary way to all of this, what we have is the new behavioral tools, the use of behavioral insights, which we collected from multidisciplinary research in behavioral science, in psychology, sociology, anthropology, which helps us better understand how people behave. And nudge is one of those tools, which are about choice architecture types of intervention that steer us in the right direction, while maintaining our freedom of choice and without kind of significantly changing and altering the economic incentive. So what we've seen is rise of units around the world. But before I go into this, essentially we do three things in those units of behavioral science. The first one is we then dissect. We dissect from a behavioral lens, which allows us to see the whole world of stakeholders with a behavioral lens. We understand more the drivers, the biases, what gets them to tick. So this is the first thing that we actually do, apply that behavioral lens to the reality that we see. And that allows us to better design interventions and policies and programs based on that superior understanding of human nature. And thirdly, once we can design those interventions, the third thing that is really big innovation is we put it to test. We test what works from what does not work, ideally using what we call randomized controlled trials. And since 2010, this movement has been really mushrooming in an amazing way, starting with David Cameron setting up the first, what we call nudge unit in the world. In parallel, President Obama has been working on his own social behavioral science team with Cass Sunstein. And basically, we've seen an amazing uptake of behavioral science team around the world. So we've seen that in kind of all continents, in government, in academia, in NGOs, and so on. In the Arab world and what we call the global South, we've seen it like starting in 2015, 2016 with BeFi, Nudge Lebanon, and now we have it in every single country, almost in the Arab world. Even those and other kind of global South, even those that don't have dedicated units as such are experimenting with those tools, which is quite amazing. So the map does not do justice to the fact that more experiments are happening outside dedicated units. And the reason is very simple. A lot of our challenges have behavioral roots, as we call them. We don't use evidence in our recommendations, and basically it's cost effective in many ways. So we started initially applying behavioral science tools to what we call plain vanilla types of intervention. So getting people either to save more or to eat healthy, few things that are more or less straightforward. And that was like the initial stage. Then we moved to the new thing that we're going to talk about today is, can we apply to more complex challenges, such as violent extremism, such as social cohesion, such as inclusion, things that are deeply rooted with structural, psychological factors, with push factors, with so much. And the answer, proudly, is yes, we can, but while managing expectations, what we can do. It's a process, and that's the essence of this guidance note. So prevention of violent extremism is one of those items that were added recently to the agenda of application of behavioral science to policy challenges. And now it's like we don't have to even prove that. It's there, it's accepted, it's adopted and espoused at the highest level in every single government at the UN level. And now we see it as a reality. So what we have in front of us here is just looking at the pathway. We depicted that some 5 years ago just to see where do we step in. And this is part of kind of designing a journey of a stakeholder to see where do we come in with behavioral tools and behavioral science. What we see is that initially there's the vulnerable population at large. They are in proximity of conflict zone, for instance, and then there is possibly going further when you start not only vulnerable, but you start expressing interest or becoming socially engaged somehow through social media and so on. Or you become a adopter of all these values of radicalization, become radicalized, and some people go all the way to active. So kind of by way to try to make it a little bit more interactive before moving, we just want to ask you, where do you think is behavioral science applicable? In stages 1, 2, 3, 4, or kind of all of them initially, at the end, in the middle? Let's pause and then get some feedback as to where we think behavioral insight, at what stage in those 4 stages are applicable. We'll take a few seconds to get some answers.
give it a few more seconds because the response is zooming in.
Right. So I think we're getting the feel. It's true. Most of you have a lot of you have focused on stages 1 and 2. It's effectively where we see it most applied, and basically what we see is most effective is phase 1, and the window starts narrowing down as we get to fully active and fully radicalized. Although I have to say that even towards the end, there are ways to bring back people who are either fully engaged and then taking off, going back to their country. So we need to find the right opportunity to re-engage them or disengage them, as it were. But overall, stages 1 and 2 are the ones where we're mostly kind of successful in preventing. And that's the concept of prevention of violent extremism versus, once they're fully engaged, countering the violent extremism. That's the simplest way of putting it. Now, when we start thinking of the stages that I mentioned, which is applying behavioral insights in experiments, it's good to keep in mind 2 levels of such application. The first level is what we call overlaying behavioral insights on top of existing programs, which is essentially another way to dissect a problem in basically a long journey and try to enhance its effectiveness in some ways, regardless of whether it's effectively social cohesion, inclusion, education, training. So effectively applying BeHi as a layer on top of program from beginning to end, from increasing the mobilization of participants in a program to getting them more engaged, all the way to kind of getting them to follow through on the learnings of what they've done. So in that sense, we look for entry points in this, in the process, which we'll discuss, which we call mobilize, engage, follow through. So that's the first level, which in a way could be agnostic to what the actual topic is. The second thing that we say that we could apply behavioral insight at is the direct application, and that's becomes more interesting. So there we take the challenge, which is essentially a violent extremism challenge or things around it, and try to apply behavioral science concept, such as maybe demystifying certain concepts, debunking fake news, relating to certain values, applying it not only to radicalization, to violent extremism, to inclusion, social cohesion, but also applying that to the risk factors surrounding violent extremism. So that is very important to see. And we basically can use a lot of tools to support that direct application of behavioral science. What we've done in countering violent extremism in the case of fake news is such example. What we've seen with the values affirmation with prisoners that are kind of prisoners of violent extremism also is such a thing that can be applied. There's the values affirmation, but there are so many other tools could be applied head on to support that intervention and behaviorally inform that challenge. Now, going forward, what we would like to cover is this guidance note. So we talked about how the rise of behavioral science movements started from straightforward challenges all the way to more complex challenges such as BE, and then how we depicted that pathway, and then how we started applying experiments at 2 levels, that layering and that direct application. Then we thought with our partners, with UNDP, who started thinking with us, can we kind of institutionalize this? Can we document that so that it becomes a step-by-step approach to applying behavioral insights to so many? And that's what we try to do in this guidance note. So what it is, it's a guidance note that seeks to help users navigate the process and see where they could apply behavioral insights into their own operation of PCV in the widest sense, in the direct concept of violent extremism and things surrounding it as well. Who is it for? For essentially practitioners, UN organization by and large, their implementing agencies, the security apparatus in governments who could work with this. Where it could be applied, as I said, could be applied in the widest sense of the PCVE, the prevention and even the countering, as well as similar journey, that's just the conflict zone. And how? Essentially, it's about a step-by-step practical tool. So it takes the various stages, and we've identified 6 stages we will be talking about. And these stages are what each practitioner, each one working in the value chain of violent extremism, whether it's a policymaker, whether it's someone who's in charge of regulation of certain activities, whether they are into monitoring and evaluation, or whether they are implementation agencies. So all of these, what I call PCVE value chain stakeholders, could be applying this guidance note in those 6 steps. And basically, we start by defining the overall parameters. Essentially here, we'll talk about the target behaviors, then looking at who are the target population that we're going to look at. And identifying this is also a process, because in every challenge, there are a multitude of stakeholders. And for everyone, there's a journey. And for each journey, there's several entry points. What you end up having when you dissect that challenge, you will end up with a long list of potential interventions and entry points. And then the question is, how do you optimize? How do you prioritize? Or do you create ease of implementation framework together with impact? And then you select the entry points, and then you start dissecting the behavioral from non-behavioral bottlenecks, and then focus on those, look at the biases, look at how to counter them. And then comes the choice of tools. We use our now very common shape difference tool of behavioral science, where every letter stands for one type of behavioral intervention. So we select those, we see at what stage and what does it try to counter. And finally, which is kind of the bread and butter of what we do, how do we measure what works from what doesn't? Are we going to be able to do a randomized control trial, or are we going to do a rigorous pre-post, or are we going to do difference in difference? This is what we will do. So what we will do next is take each one of them and pose and kind of tell you what are the key considerations, what are things that we look at, and then maybe pose some questions to kind of keep you engaged. Nabil will go through this, and then I will follow up with some illustrations to complement, and both of us will do the same. So Nabil, take it over from here, please.
Thank you, Doctor, and hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Dr. Fadi mentioned, we're going to go through the stages quickly, just to take you through them, and we'll provide insights from our end about not only what we mentioned in the guidance note, but also the kind of insights that we got from the implementation and the assessments of the data that we've seen, and the lessons learned from the ground that we've learned, and we'll tell you about the results that we've observed. So in the first stage is really defining the parameters. So here we always try to tell our stakeholders and everyone we're working with to really define the challenge as accurately as they can possibly do. Because PVE is not something tangible. It's many things, as Dr. Fadi mentioned. All these factors working together that help or cause this person or this group of individuals to go down the path of radicalization. So when we want to assess this challenge and we want to address prevention and countering violent extremism, where do we start? Behavioral insights is not a panacea for all challenges. So we want to see, are we trying to prevent participation in violent extremism groups? Are we trying to support certain behaviors? Are we trying to encourage behaviors that help these individuals to become, grow more resilient against them? And once we try to start having an idea of what we really want to do, we start seeing what are the behaviors that could be observed and measured. because at the end of the day, we want something that could be assessed as an experiment, something that could be tested on the field. And the best way to test and apply these things is through observing what are the behaviors that lend themselves for changing. Whenever you have a baseline of a certain trend, of certain behavior, you can then try to affect it, change it, and you see the impact. Is it going up? Is it going down? And to do that, we look also on the ongoing projects. That means, as you heard earlier, that sometimes it would be easier to layer behavioral insights on top of things that are that exist already, and this way you can take these projects, learn from them, and you can scale them up at a later stage. The second stage, once we have the challenge identified, we try to look into the existing data, the available streams of information that could be analyzed. We sort through them to see what do these trends tell us, what are the emerging behaviors of individuals in the different kinds of outcomes that are of interest to us. If we're not very sure about the data and we don't see data available, then we need to think of proxies. What are indirect ways of measuring the outcomes of our interest? Which information do we have that tells us the populations that are most vulnerable? Because of course, when you are running an intervention, you want to target a certain population. We'll talk about this in the second stage in a minute. And lastly, we want to engage with relevant stakeholders. Who are the organizations on the ground, who are doing outreach, who are doing work on the field, to see what kind of channels, what kind of networks are already established. In many of the projects that we do, one thing that requires a lot of time is really establishing these networks, getting the resources on the ground, getting the any kind of frameworks on the ground. In the next step, we're looking at the target population. And here we want to ask ourselves, where does the target population live? We want to make these individuals as concrete as possible. We want to make them as human as possible. Where do they regularly go? Where do they work? Which school? What are their hobbies? And to do that, we usually build a persona around the target populations that we're working with. And we encourage our team and our stakeholders to really draw these individuals, give them a name, gender, identity, education, map out their average day. What are the different, are there any differences between weekdays and weekends? Are there any activities that they do on a typical day? And we share these personas with others who are working on the field for feedback. Especially during Corona time, we've had a number of projects where we were forced to work remotely, and we relied on the individuals working on the field to be able to be our eyes and ears and to tell us whether what we are thinking is an accurate depiction. And we have here today a number of the team with whom we had the pleasure to work. Before I jump into the next step, I would like to pause here. And this is one of the projects that we worked on in Lebanon regarding domestic violence. And here I want you to unmute or contribute in the chat box about the stakeholders that you think would be relevant. So just quickly, domestic violence in Lebanon is a big issue, and we've seen this issue being getting worse even during the last few years, not only because of Corona and the lockdowns and victims and aggressors being stuck at the same place, same house, but also because of the economic situation that Lebanon is undergoing. So if we were to reduce domestic violence in Lebanon, who would be our key stakeholders? Feel free to drop your suggestions in the chat. You don't have to only think about who you want to change their behavior. Think of who are the individuals, who are the stakeholders at large, who could be involved in the process from A to Z.
Of course, there are the perpetrators, there are the victims, but who else? And that's the question, because sometimes we might be able to do several interventions on several stakeholders. So that's the beauty of dissecting who are the stakeholders, so that we see where do we have an entry point with whom. So I hear people like mentioning family, absolutely. We hear the police, absolutely. Police is a very important piece, behaviorally informing their process, make sure there are no kind of sludge in the process. Looking at NGOs, very important to also make sure we train them in behavioral science and communication, so that they could simplify the process and then speak more to people. The medical practitioners who kind of diagnose the victims sometimes. Religious leaders and community leaders who could be also very powerful in this program. Media, bystanders, what is it that they can do? Do certain things. So basically, this is just an example to let you know, when you look at the challenge, don't look at the most obvious only, the perpetrators and the victims. Look at the whole kind of landscape. And then from there, we start seeing, effectively, we depict the journey of each one of them in that process and see the entry points for where we could do things. Nabil, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Fadi, and thank you everyone for the great contributions. This is exactly the kind of brainstorming that needs to happen before we start digging into any project and we start prioritizing which stakeholder to engage with and how to do that. The next stage is selecting the entry points, and here it's the mapping that we spoke about. So at which stage can we apply BIs? And we have for this a useful framework. We call it Mobilize, Engage, and Follow Through, which is a journey mapping. And let's take an example here that you have a certain program meant for vulnerable and at-risk individuals in the community, and you want to optimize the outcomes of this program. So with Mobilize, Engage, and Follow Through, you can start thinking about the different phases. So Mobilize is before you start the actual program. How do you capture the attention? How do you get the target individuals to attend these events? So you want them to hear about it, you want them to register, you want them to actually go there. And then once you have them, you want them to be engaged, right? So this is during the workshop itself. You want them to participate, you want them to feel in a safe environment where they can give freely, contribute the ideas freely and exchange ideas and really benefit from it. And the last stage is after this workshop. So after individuals, they attend and everyone goes in their own way, how can we ensure that there is going to be follow through? If we're teaching the individuals some skills, if we're asking the individuals to conduct certain steps to improve their well-being, to improve their socioeconomic status, how can we make sure that they're going to be following through and delivering, fulfilling these things? And the first example, Dr. Fadi, over to you.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the first example and the early stage. And this is something we've done. It's a great source of pride. We've done it with this amazing UNDP team in Yemen, who worked throughout the hardship and kind of managed to pull this off with us. So really kudos to all those who were involved in this amazing program, one of the first in that area. So basically what we've done here, the objective was to kind of motivate the sustained participation of vulnerable youth in psychosocial support program organized by the Yemen Stabilization Program. So the idea is to bring them, these are vulnerable, these are kind of, we're trying to get them to speak, to debrief, to be part of community cohesion program. And they are in proximity of various violent extremists. So the intervention was really to use behaviorally informed kind of tools to make sure they are attracted by this. So literally, even at that stage of designing the poster, how do you inject in it the right behavioral science tool? What is it do you get to put in it so that when they stop and then maybe register, that you push it a little bit more by creating some kind of a commitment or pledge that even once they're interested, say they will attend, they will actually deliver on attending this. And even if they attend the first session, you want them to follow through and attend the next session. So really, it's an amazing example of layering behavioral insights on an existing program. And at that stage of getting them kind of interested, recruiting them to attend the sessions, getting them a reminder, getting them a pledge to really say that they will, and then making sure that they turn up, and if the first turn up, they turn up again. And the results were fascinating. So we managed to increase those who participated in more sessions, and it was particularly effective with the male attenders in particular. So that's an example of kind of layering BI on top of existing programs, particularly in the mobilization stage. We'll give you another example of taking it further. So people are registered in a program, and now we want them engaged. So we want to maximize the learning outcomes of what they're getting from a program. It was not initially, in this one, it was not a violent extremism. It was a vulnerable group, a group of dropout children between age of maybe 18 and 25 who never completed formal education. So there were so many beautiful programs, UN agencies, implementation agencies, CSOs, who tried to give them informal education, literacy training programs in math, English, and Arabic. And the idea is to try to reintegrate them in society somehow. And then we noticed with those groups that even after going through this informal education, very few of them are getting the passing rate after 2-3 months of education, partly because of that feeling of incapability or that stereotype threat. So we've seen that kind of, there's a lot of intervention that happened in the US, in the UK, in so many other countries, what we call values affirmation, helping people affirm certain values that are important for them to neutralize that feeling of stereotype threat. So what we've done is gave a group of them that value affirmation tool just before they sat for the test. And then the control group, we gave them the placebo exercise, and the treatment got an exercise which is to look at some of the values that are meaningful for them, and ask them to reflect and maybe draw something around them. So from faith examples, or courage, or sense of humor, or positivism, optimism. So and the beautiful results were fascinating, is that those who got that values affirmation scored higher in a statistically significant way on some of the test scores in Arabic. So bearing that in mind, as we were discussing with colleagues from UNDP, and particularly UNDP Sudan, they thought there's an opportunity, particularly with the prisoners of violent extremism in Sudan, who are going through some kind of catching up on education while they're in prison. And the whole idea is to make sure that while they're in prison, they are kind of given the chance to improve their skills so that they don't relapse into violent extremism once they serve their sentence. So, and they've noticed that they're not doing as well in those education exams that they're allowed to sit for while in prison. So again, that was an opportunity to give that group the values affirmation to improve their learning outcome, which was also very successful, which Sudan have been talking a lot about. The third one, which I think Nabil is very kind of excited to talk about, is the next step, which is the follow through. What do we want to apply behavioral insights on a program to maximize the learning outcomes for that? And I'm mindful of the time, so we'll go through this, Nabil, go through this, and then quickly, so that we move to the next steps.
Right. Thank you, Doctor. So we saw that in Pakistan, the colleagues were doing an amazing job with a number of programs meant to build the capacity of males and females. And for women particularly, there was a service called the Gender Desk, which offers 6 different services to women who are vulnerable at risk, who are part of the program and the wider community as well. So it was open for everyone, free of charge services. It's a no-brainer that it's a great thing for everyone to benefit from, offering psychosocial support, offering legal advice, health, education, people with disabilities, all these services. Unfortunately, we've seen that the uptake of these programs, as amazing as they sound, was suboptimal. So we want to do a pilot where we get women who hear about these services during the trainings to actually go and start using them afterwards. With this in mind, we designed 2 things, which took into consideration the various contextual details of working with the target population in Pakistan. And we can have an entire session talking about all of this by itself, because there are multiple challenges when it comes to technology, when it comes to infrastructure, that got us to design something that is physical, that could be distributed to women in the training sessions, and that they can keep with them later on, and to help them remember the gender desk. So if I zoom in here quickly, you can see that it provides information about what are the different services that are being offered, following with a calendar where a person can specify the date and time during which they can go to the gender desk, and it provides them also with a checklist of what are the key items that they have in terms of documents to have with them when they go, and contact information. This was followed by the other document, which was a reminder given at a later stage in the same training, at a later session, with a checklist of what are the services that they would like to use, and the same kind of contact information. And we see that the treatment group who received these 2 very simple physical cards, they were it more than doubled the number of reports that are being channeled to the desk. Moving on, and the 4th step is where we look at the biases and the behavioral barriers. And for this, we usually categorize them into 3 categories: information processing, sense making, and fast decision making. I have to say that this is not exhaustive. We have a much longer list of biases, but these are the most prominent and most relevant to the PCVE context. The first kind of bias is the information processing. This happens as a result of missing important information because we don't have the bandwidth. We are being bombarded by information all the day. We sometimes miss important information that we cannot focus on. One of these biases is confirmation bias. And this tends to, we tend to see this in politics, in times of elections, in times of wherever you see polarity, you see confirmation bias, where people with radical tendencies tend to read something that is critical to their opinion. They would try to fact check it and find errors in the logic. But when it's propaganda that is in favor of their cause, then they will be less, they will feel it, it's more accepted, and they will have less scrutiny. The second type of biases is the sense making. And
I think let's not give examples on this because I think running out of time, but just list those types of biases so that we move to maybe one exercise from the vaccine example.
Right. So, okay, I'm going to jump through this quickly. So, sense making, we tend to see to create some kind of links, and sometimes these are incorrect or biased interpretations. And here we have projection bias. In the third category, we have fast decision making, and obviously biases are rules of thumb and heuristics that allow us to make very quick decisions, but with speed there are errors and could lead to suboptimal decisions. And here we have loss aversion. Before the last step, we have relevant BI tools. And as Dr. Fadi mentioned already, we have the shape difference framework, in which we list 15 different tools that we frequently use in our designs. And we'll take one example, which is norms. And we see it here in this illustration for gender-based violence. And it says only 11% of women who experience sexual assault report it. From the first look, that sounds okay, that sounds fine. But if we start thinking about it, what is this telling us exactly? This message, along with the illustration, it's telling us that the norm in the society around us is that the minority, very few women who actually experience assault, go ahead and report it. And we see this also here. But is this really what we want to give to a woman who has been assaulted and a woman who is doubtful and in a very difficult mental situation to be able, someone who's looking for affirmation to go and report? This will tell her, no, not really, you shouldn't, like, because none of the women in the society are doing that. So I'm going to stop here and ask you this question. What would you do? And I'll give you a hint. It's about changing the first word. Instead of saying only, what would you do to make this statement sounding better, more encouraging for a woman who is a victim of gender-based violence to go ahead and report? Please, let's take a few seconds and answer this question. We have 4 options. We have finally, we have yes, we have now, we have approximately. You guys are natural. You guys are doing a really good job. Some people have been doing their homework, going through the guidance note.
Great. Yeah, I mean, let's show. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think now, and it is that way to behaviorally inform that poster is ideally to put a now, because now gives the impression that it's upward sloping and it's dynamic, and that's a beautiful way to project and update the social norms to people. It's very powerful. We've seen it even in cases where it's not majoritarian. So we've seen the classic case of social norm telling people 90% are doing this, or 80%. That's more or less the easy one. But the more difficult one is really, how do you get, when you have a small figure, a small trend, but it's upward going, how do you use that? So adding that now sometimes is all it takes to create that dynamic updating of message. And we've seen how a lot of people capture that. So moving on to another example, Nabil, which is the designing of the experiment.
The last one is the design of the right experiment. And we always want to use an experiment. Why? Because this is how we know what works and what does not work. This is how we gather evidence that can help us inform future programs. Even when we don't have something that works, we know then what doesn't work. And this allows us to have more better informed way of doing things. So a very famous framework is the test, learn, adapt. First, test using a robust method to evaluate the effectiveness of an intervention. Learn from the outcomes, even if it doesn't work. Identify why did it not work, whether the effect size is big enough to justify the cost of the intervention, and adapt to have a second iteration where we have an improved version. Our golden standard for experimentation has always been randomized controlled trials. They've been a bit misjudged previously for being too expensive, but with the right kind of setup, you can run something at an appropriate sample size where you give the intervention and you measure the outcomes. I'm going to be talking about one of the interventions that we've done recently, and we've run this intervention online on an online sample, but we are currently preparing to launch it on the field. This is a game that we developed with colleagues from Cambridge University called Radicalize. The game is meant to combat online recruitment strategies used by extremist organizations through getting people through a journey of 4 stages that represent the 4 stages that we got from literature about how recruitment happens in these online environments. So we take them through the identification of the target population, how to approach them, how to isolate them, how to activate them to become radicalized. But we do it in a way that doesn't get people confused with the purpose, that this is only a game. We did it with a way to have a humorous language, to have many jokes, to have many examples that keep us alerted that this is just for educational purposes. And at the end of the experiment, what we did, we asked people questions in the treatment group who played Radicalized and in the control group who played Tetris game. We asked them a few questions to assess whether playing the game really worked. And what we did was we got them to assess exchanges on WhatsApp, like the one you see here, to tell us how manipulative they find the person they are talking to be. So let's stop here and give this a shot. I want you to read through this quickly and tell me on a scale from 1 to 7, 1 being not at all and 7 being very, how manipulative you find this person. Roxani, can we have the poll question? Thank you very much. Okay, I think we can stop here and we move to the results. You guys, majority have said 4, 5, 6, and 7, and you are right. This is an example, and we see that for the control group, before playing here and then after playing, they sort of had the same kind of results, and even the control and treatment before playing, they were the same. But after playing, the control remained the same, while the treatment jumped all the way up on the 7-point scale, and it's an average of 6.2. We did the same with vignettes. We asked individuals to rate how vulnerable they think these individuals were. We can skip this one for the sake of time, and we had variable vulnerable and non-vulnerable vignettes. For the control group and the treatment before playing, they saw that the vulnerable vignettes are the same. After playing, the control remained the same, the treatment jumped up in terms of assessment. For the non-vulnerable, and this is a very interesting insight here from this tool, before playing and after playing, the treatment did not change. So we see here it jumped when it was vulnerable vignettes, but when it's not vulnerable, it remained the same. And this is an indication that people they did not become polarized, they did not become skeptical about all people, and they just spammed 7 in all answers to all questions. So this is a great insight that tells us people were actually actively engaged in the process. So I'll stop here, hand it over back to Dr. Fadi.
So where do we go from here? We have gone through an amazing journey from whether that science can be applied to complex issues, to which we said yes, and we embarked on several journeys in several countries with our colleagues, and we showed more and more that behavioral insights can be applied to complex challenges and violent extremism. But now we are at a crossroad. We need to take that further, and the only way to take that further is not for us only to do experiment with you, but to scale up this through capacity building, and that's what is needed, and capacity building across the entire value chain of the prevention and countering of violent extremism. And that's what really will make it kind of go from just normal growth and uptake of BI to really a great growth going forward. So what we've seen recently, and that is quite amazing, is that guidance note that was launched a few days ago by the Secretary General of the United Nations, which really is very similar also to the executive order which President Obama did 1 year after piloting with the social and behavioral science team. And of course, the CAS has been working in the background on all of CAS has been working in the background all of this, and what they've done is really called on the government, the US government agencies, to all adopt behavioral science in their work, review their program from that angle, create more capacity, reach out to the social behavioral science team. And since then, we've seen that the behavioral science movement in the US has grown in an amazing way across all government units. And that's what the Secretary General of the UN is now trying to do. He has seen that behavioral science is picking up at UNDP, at UNOCT, and several agencies, but in an ad hoc way. So what he wants to happen is to see more institutionalization. And that guidance note is an amazing piece to push everybody at the United Nations and their partners to adopt behavioral science in their work. It's quite amazing. And this is what we would like to see more at the government level, at the highest level of government, pushing ministries, government agencies to exactly do this. I will end with a few thoughts just to recap what we learned from behavioral science in this area, which is one, that we are, as I said, beyond piloting, and capacity building is going to be the way to take behavioral science uptake to the next level. As I said again earlier, intervention at the prevention level is very important, looking at the risk factors before we move to the only the countering. Working with the PVE stakeholders could have a domino effect, not only those who are working on the ground, but even earlier, getting more parliamentarians and policymakers to behaviorally inform regulations. So that's also very important. It will increase the uptake, and the guidance note works towards this. At the same time, it's important to manage expectations. This is by no means a panacea. It's something that helps us inject more realism in our understanding, design better behaviorally informed solutions, and test them, and have measurable improvement. So that's also important to do. And finally, again, not to shy away from failures, because failures are part of any normal laboratory, and then testing, learning, and adapting is what we should be doing. So multiple iterations are okay, and then talk about it, document what does not work so that you could improve it later on. It has been an immense pleasure and an amazing journey with all of you colleagues. Looking forward to hearing more from you. Thank you on behalf of Nabil and I.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maki and Nabil. As you can all tell, we could speak about the guidance note and all the wealth of information associated with it for hours. I've put the link in the chat, so please do have a look. Feel free to reach out for more information. Sadly, we're running out of time. Maybe if the colleagues have a couple more minutes. There was one question in the chat, Dr. Maki, about sustainability. There were several dimensions layered into that question, but if you were to answer it in 30 seconds in terms of ensuring sustainability of behavior change in this space, what would you say?
It's one of the design principles. When we're looking at several ideas or several potential interventions, you try to see which ones has more potential for habit formation. And these are the ones which would be more sustainable and pick up. But we've seen also some lapses after initial kind of success, going back to the mean. So that is one more reason why we should keep an eye, constantly work with the stronger impact experiments, and then keep kind of innovating, testing, learning, and readapting, making whatever worked the new control, and then test with more innovative improvements all the time.
Thanks for the concise answer. I believe we'll need to wrap this up, also because there's a new session starting for Young Behavioral Science Week. There's a session on lessons learned on mainstreaming behavioral science. So please join for that as well. But just to wrap up, I see Nika Saidi, who's our global PV team lead, on camera. Nika, if you were to say in 1 minute, where are we going with this at UNDP?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Fadi, Nabil, and colleagues. And also I want to acknowledge many colleagues from our country offices who were part of this experiment are here with us, but we didn't do well and justice to ask them also to contribute, to apologize to them. What we try to do, we have 40 countries who are doing PBE. We need to address the importance of inclusivity. We need to do better programming, and using the BI is one way forward. And we are committed to make sure that we are using the behavior inside, not only in the program and as the layering process that Fadi and Nabil were mentioning, but also as part of the monitoring and evaluation that we are exploring further. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you Roxani and also Jennifer, who is not here, because for helping us and being part of this initiative together. Thanks.
Thank you, Nika. Thank you, Dr. Fadi. Thank you, Nabil. Thanks to the audience and the country office colleagues who joined us. And yes, please stay in touch. Bye. Have a nice rest of your day.
Bye-bye.